Okay. So the
I
recording
don't
is
think
there.
we have enough people to run the meeting. Yeah.
That's my thought. I just wanted to confirm that, and then we can put in the meeting minutes that next week we will not have a meeting. So I think that covers my item. I can do that. Now, Leigh and Whitney, next is, thanks, Lynn, for updating the minutes. You want to talk about the open telemetry stuff?
Yeah. So sorry for the permission issues. I tried to put this doc into the community drive, but I don't have permission to do that. So I have a temporary workout to share a published link, but that link, I'm not sure you can comment on it. But this is an early preview. Me and Whitney, we just want to present it early and get some early feedback. It's a work in progress. Let me go through this doc. Give me 1 sec. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say I still can't access it, but go ahead.
Can you access the temporary workaround? There is a published version that's supposed to be accessible for entire internet.
Where is the public link?
In the combined, in the meeting notes, I have this one. Yeah, Eric, I see you have a cursor on there.
Yeah, I cannot get it. You need permission to access this document.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Same for me.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I will ping Francis regarding to the permission issue. Sorry. Yeah, I will follow up on this. Okay. So first is some context. What's the reason we are proposing this work? So mainly a few things. One is Istio currently uses the Open Sensors SDK for telemetry, and Open Sensors is in sunset process. And the approximate timeline is the Open Sensors folks want to deprecate it by end of this year. Another issue we want to solve is about the proprietary metric names and labels. So essentially, right now, all Istio metrics are proprietary using the Istio.io, naming conventions, and we hope to conform to industry standards of open telemetry. They have the semantic convention standard. So if we use the industry standard, then the customers they don't need to use any proprietary metric names and labels. So the goal of this talk is design the transition to using open telemetry to generate telemetry, and also to standardize Istio metrics and labels. So I will skip the glossary section, and for the existing work, I can quickly give an overview. So Istio telemetry currently support a few things: access log, tracing metrics, and application logs. And it also supports control plane metrics and data plane metrics. And it supports exporting metrics through Stackdriver and Prometheus. And it also supports integration with visualization tools such as Kiali. And there is an example of how the current Istio telemetry using the Open Sensors API to export a metric. So I'm not going to go through these details. Yeah, next is the design part for transition to open telemetry. So first item is access log. So open telemetry access log support has been added to Istio. So it's already there, and it's using a push-based mechanism. The access log will be pushed to open telemetry collector, and the collector is configurable. So next, so for tracing, Whitney is going to present the details later. The high level idea is tracing, open telemetry tracing for in Istio will follow the open telemetry access log approach. So use the a collector, but I will skip this for now, and Whitney will talk about it later. Okay, next is metrics, right? So currently there is no open telemetry Envoy API for metrics. So we have a potential approach to tackle this issue is to first, we use the open telemetry Envoy access log API to export the access logs, then extract the metrics from access log. So this approach solves the lack of Envoy open telemetry metric API. Yeah. Someone raise the hand or?
Yeah. So to be clear, I mean, their access logs based metrics are useful for some metrics like request counts and this kind of stuff. But there are a lot of metrics that are not suitable for this. So we no matter what, we'll still need to have Prometheus exposed.
Yeah.
For the common metrics, agent restarts and all the other metrics that
exactly.
We have.
Yeah.
And I assume there is no plan to change from Prometheus metrics export, which is currently used, and it's broadly available, just to provide an extra option for the access logs to be used for deriving some telemetry.
Yeah. Yeah, you are totally correct. That's the reason in the second part, so is we're going to use the Prometheus, we'll scrape the metric, from Envoy or from control plane. So this will be continued supported. And I think Quad also mentioned there is an effort to add such API. Yeah, Quad, please.
Yeah, there is a PR open to add metrics sync to Envoy that sends directly to hotel. But this is Envoy metrics, meaning it's standard native metrics from Envoy as well as Istio request total Prometheus metric.
We are not talking about replacing. I mean, we could support it in addition to Prometheus, but I don't think we are in a position at this point to say that we are dropping support or we are no longer defaulting to Prometheus as a.
So it doesn't matter because the source of truth is the same for hotel and Prometheus. You can have both at the same time.
I don't know. It matters for people who consume. I mean, there are all kinds of CI/CD systems and all kind of tooling and infrastructure around looking at Prometheus metrics.
Yeah, I understand it, but I don't think Prometheus is relevant to this discussion because it doesn't matter, right? I mean, you can have both of them.
Yeah, Costin. So if I understand you correctly, right, your point is we should have open telemetry metric exporting mechanism together with the Prometheus, and the default one will be the open telemetry metric exportation system. So it will not break the existing pipeline of customers. And then optionally, they can use Prometheus to for metrics. Is my understanding correct?
I think, I mean, for tracing an access log, it's a very clear decision, and I don't see any concerns about using open telemetry in hotel protocol. But Prometheus in particular, again, there are two standards, and both of them are valid.
Can I ask? So I think when you talk metrics, you have to be careful to explain which metric. If you're talking about Envoy metrics, like things like listener, and cluster, that is always there. You cannot disable it. No one is, no one's going to disable it. It's not possible. If you're talking about Istio request total, that is something we might consider disabling for Prometheus. I think that's an option. Are you referring to Istio request total or referring to listener metrics?
I'm referring to both. For Istio request, again, there is Kiali, there is Argo CD. There are plenty of tools that are integrating with the Prometheus metric. I don't think we can disable it, and there is no reason. I mean, Prometheus Open Metrics is a standard that is much broader used for metrics than Open Telemetry current protocol, and I think they are merging, so it won't be a discussion anyway. I think
they are one-to-one. So you could do the thing that was suggested, is to send hotel metrics to hotel collector and then expose Prometheus metrics from there.
We could, but why? I mean, if we already send expose Prometheus metrics directly from the workload, and the application itself is exposing Prometheus metrics, why would we introduce another point and lose some? Because the hotel collector is aggregating, is doing all kind of stuff that may not be necessarily aligned with what we are exposing. Anyway, let's not get too much into this detail. I think I just want to I don't think we have consensus on not supporting Prometheus as a default or as a safe option given the current market.
Yeah, I agree. Let's move on. We can, follow up these details later. Yeah. So next part is application log. This is not access logs, right? So the Envoy OpenTelemetry API for application log don't exist yet. And the next part is OpenTelemetry collector. So currently we use this for access log. When we add the tracing metrics and log support, we can also use the OpenTelemetry collector to collect these, essentially pushing, this is pushing based, to get these metrics and logs and tracing. And I think Quat also mentioned that once you have this on the collector, Prometheus integration can be done on the collector. For example, Prometheus can get all this from collector. Next part is the semantic convention, right? So this part is the standardization for the metric names and metric attributes, labels. So Istio should adopt OpenTelemetry semantic conventions for its metrics. And Istio actually should define and upstream the semantic conventions to OpenTelemetry for all the service meshes, right? Because Istio is a de facto service mesh standard. And we can start something, a smaller set of metric names and metric attributes that are essential for service mesh traffic, and we can extend them over time. For example, for metrics, we can define and upstream the service mesh metric for latency, delivery ratio, traffic volume, etc. And for the metric attributes, we can define, for example, source and destination workload names, network protocol, TLS version, etc. So basically start with a smaller set, then extend them over time. Yeah. Next part, I'm going to talk about roadmap. So for OpenTelemetry access log, Istio already supported. And for OpenTelemetry trace, we are going to use the Envoy OpenTelemetry trace API with a similar approach of OpenTelemetry access log. And the owner, Whitney, will own this part. And for the OpenTelemetry metrics, we can start from the OpenTelemetry access log-based approach, and the metrics will be extracted from access log, and we will keep the support of Prometheus-based approach. And currently, we put Whitney as a placeholder for now, and we are looking for owners for this item. So for semantic conventions, we are also looking for owners for this item. For application logs, because this API doesn't exist, we need to get the timelines from Envoy and OpenTelemetry community to get their timeline regarding to their replacement for the OpenCensus API. And we are also looking for owners for this item. So now I'm going to hand over to Whitney for the tracing. Yeah.
Thank you, Lee. Hi, everyone. So in our tracing proposal, we will like to configure the Envoy proxies to generate their traces in the OpenTelemetry format. Once the traces are generated, we want those traces to be exported to an OpenTelemetry collector, and then the end user can configure that collector to export the collected traces to a tracing backend of their choice. For example, Jaeger or Zipkin or any other tracing backend that can integrate with OTel collector. So the OpenTelemetry format is actually Envoy tracing extension named envoy.config.trace.v3.OpenTelemetry.config. And that is what is responsible for instructing the Envoy instances to generate their traces using the OTel protocol. So right now, that extension is a work in progress, and functionality is incomplete, and it's not intended for production use as yet. In fact, it also has an unknown security posture where it's recommended to use this extension in deployments where both the downstream and upstream is trusted. But we synced with the Envoy community, and we have been reassured that making this production ready is a priority, and we are tracking the progress towards that using this Mac OpenTelemetry as ready for production use Istio. So overall, our tracing implementation is going to be based on this Envoy tracing extension and Envoy OpenTelemetry tracing extension. And we are going to be dependent on Envoy continuing to improve their support for OpenTelemetry tracing. But we believe in doing so, we are aligning Istio with the OpenTelemetry standard, and it's providing us a pathway for deprecating OpenCensus tracing as of right now. The implementation taken with this tracing is pretty similar to the approach taken with the OpenTelemetry access logs. And in creating this design, we are fully aware that there's a lot of room for improving the design and implementation of both the access logs and the tracing. I see several hands up. Happy Custom, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, that's wonderful. I mean, using Envoy access tracing and the other support, that's implementation detail. I think the main question is around what do we expect the API surface to be, and both in terms of configuring, how do you find the agent or the hotel sync, and also in terms of fine-tuning, what percentage and those other things that we want to expose and the question is if this should be an Istio API that is specific to Istio with sidecar workloads, if it's something that we want to discuss as part of Gamma or Kubernetes as a generic API that all meshes will use. It's something that OpenTelemetry defines, and I saw that OpenTelemetry the environment variable specification has some coverage about some tuning for this, and this kind of details on how users will interact with the system.
That's a great point. In fact, as of right now, we have designed the interaction to be at the mesh config level, which I'll be going into a bit further on, and the telemetry API level. But I do like taking this discussion at a higher level to like the wider Kubernetes community or its own separate API.
Yeah. So Costin, currently access log, right? OpenTelemetry access log is configured through the Istio telemetry API as an OpenTelemetry provider. And the mesh config is used to configure the OpenTelemetry collector, the endpoint. So to answer your question, right? So we will have a percentage of tracing, right? And another config is the provider. So likely there are two configurations. One is who is the provider, right? For example, we can have a provider called OpenTelemetry tracing, and then we have a configuration of the percentage, which all follow the current tracing configurations through the OpenTelemetry telemetry. And also this is consistent with the access log based, the configuration for access log.
We were discussing in the previous meeting about Safe Istio and all the alpha APIs, including mesh config and telemetry today. What is the path forward for them? And I know how it works today. I'm asking how do you want to work it in ambient in the future where we may interoperate with other meshes, and we have kind of a broader scope. And we promote the current telemetry beta API to beta, so we have a telemetry only API for Istio only, or do we adopt some other standards? Do we use the existing mesh config for OpenTelemetry, or do we use what OpenTelemetry define as discovery mechanisms for OpenTelemetry agents? And I'm not sure if the current mechanism in alpha is the right one long term.
Okay, yeah, that's a fair point. We can have so this doc is mainly for Istio, but we can follow up on the ambient and yeah.
Yes, I see John has his hand up as well.
Yeah, it feels a bit like this is really good, and we kind of covered a lot of ground here, but it feels like our priorities may be a bit inverted. To me, the important part is the actual standards and the APIs. Whether we use like all the Envoy implementation stuff, it should happen and it has to happen, and that's great, but that doesn't actually matter if we end up with non-uniform metrics across different meshes. Like, I think the end state that we want is that something like Kiali, just as an example, can work the same whether you're using Cilium or Istio or Linkerd or even a non-mesh thing, and you just have natively instrumented your application, right?
Yeah.
And today, if we followed the OpenTelemetry semantic conventions, I think they'd call it, for HTTP traffic, it would not. Like, it does not meet the needs of what we want to present in a mesh. And so I think getting those to the point where we can support them, and we do it uniformly with other products, and it supports all of our needs, is really a good goal to have. And the details of how we actually implement that are kind of secondary to that. That's really the key driver, right?
Yeah.
What we also need is, like, we have our current state, which is all proprietary Istio metrics. And then we have this future open state. We also need a transition plan for what it looks like to take users from where we are today to kind of this future.
Yeah, John, absolutely agree with you. That's a semantic convention part of this proposal. Once we conform to the OpenTelemetry standard, we can have the interoperability across the service mesh products, right? Yeah, that's a great point. And I would say, these two efforts probably are going to go in parallel, because defining this is probably going to take some time, because it is a standard similar to defining an API, right? Going to have some, discussions and get the alignment and the buy-in from OpenTelemetry folks. But I agree, it should be a priority. So we can, we probably should start investing the resources into that. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Like, they can go in parallel. It just, we say, like, we're looking for owners to this. This is future long-term work. I think that's really actually the most pressing thing. If we do all this work to use OTel libraries and stuff, and then we don't have common metrics, then we didn't really get any value, right? So it's one thing to say, okay, we export to OTLP. That's fine, but that's not really a huge benefit of where we are today if we don't have the standards.
That's right. Yeah, we transition to the API, but the data still, is proprietary, which is not ideal. So ideally, we transition to both using OpenTelemetry API and OpenTelemetry data, which is the data is the semantic convention part. And the protocol part is we were going to use OpenTelemetry OTLP, that is OpenTelemetry protocol. So protocol part, we are going to conform to the OpenTelemetry standard. I guess your point is mainly on the data part, which we absolutely agree. So this proposal, has two parts. One is the data part, another is API part. So yeah, the API part, for example, tracing, access, log, metric. Yeah, Quat? Quat, you're probably muted. I didn't hear you. Okay, Costin, please.
Yeah, I linked. So I agree there are two tracks here. One track is replacing the mesh config stuff where we specify, what I'll provider and all the settings, and replacing it with the link I put in the chat. Basically, we can auto detect that hotel collector is installed. We can use the environment variables. We can use whatever mechanism is recommended by OpenTelemetry to detect if an OpenTelemetry collector is available. So user will not have to interact with mesh config. They can have configuration per workload, per namespace, per cluster. It's basically under the control of the telemetry, whoever is the persona that controls telemetry and installs the agent. And I think that's very important because we don't want people to mess up with mesh config. The second is what John said about how we define common telemetry, and that's probably a very separate track than the first one. And the third one is API that is fine-tuning this, which again, we need to discuss if we want the Istio proprietary API and each mesh has its own API, or do we want to have a common API to fine-tune, or OpenTelemetry defines, or whoever defines how do you fine-tune the sampling rate and other stuff.
Okay, Costin, I have added this as a related work, and we're going to investigate this environment variable-based configuration. Yeah.
Okay, great. Based on the different tracks we mentioned, the remainder of this proposal is alongside the track of replacing open sensors across the mesh config and telemetry API. So based on the conventions today, we're pretty much proposing including the OpenTelemetry provider as one of the extension providers in the mesh config, with additional configuration for the Envoy OpenTelemetry tracing approach. And that Envoy OpenTelemetry tracing object is just responsible for specifying the configuration as well as the service that will be doing the collection of the traces from the mesh. So we can scroll down some more. From there, we came across, can you scroll a bit more to the configuring Envoy instances? There we go. So the above section was the extension provider on the mesh config, which will be referenced in this newly introduced Envoy OpenTelemetry tracing object. This one is more focused on how does that translate to actually telling Envoy to use the OpenTelemetry Envoy extension. And we saw that there's this tracing object on the mesh config. Right now, OpenCensus agent is one of the viable options for that. And we are pretty much replacing or adding to that the OpenTelemetry option, which will be doing the configuration of the Envoy under the hood to use the Envoy OpenTelemetry tracing extension. So from that, we go into the telemetry API, which is the general usage today, where the user could use the telemetry API to tell Istio to send traces to the hotel collector that was configured to use this Envoy tracing configuration. And we are aware that we need to provide samples for viewing these traces in the hotel UI, Kiali, Jaeger, because we notice on the Istio docs, those samples are missing, as well as we'll be updating the Istio docs to add guidance around OpenTelemetry tracing. As of right now, there's only guidance for OpenTelemetry access logs. So at a very high level, that's what we propose with providing an alternative to OpenCensus. And I think since all of the feedback we received so far, we definitely have to deep dive and create a plan in regards to the tracker on uniforming Istio's telemetry story versus addressing the sunsetting of OpenCensus. I'm going to pass the mic back to you, Lei, but if there's any questions in regards to what was mentioned, I'm happy to receive.
Yeah, any further questions?
One thing I don't know if we talked about this previously, this is relying on Envoy exposing OTel APIs. Do we have a tracking issue for adding the same to zTunnel, assuming we eventually want to do that? I know that's kind of far afield, but it's something to start thinking about, I feel like, and I don't know if we already have an issue for that.
Yeah. We will. So basically, we have two iterations. Right? One, first we start from Istio, then we move this to ambient. So ambient will also use OpenTelemetry. Yeah.
Yeah, and probably mimic the Envoy APIs where it makes sense, I guess. Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
I mean, zTunnel, as far as I know, John, can you? It's exposing Prometheus metrics and can expose OTLP because I think the library is common, but we don't have.
Okay, so it's already supported in that library. We just haven't turned it on, basically.
We need to turn it on, yes.
Okay.
That's not quite true. We actually, I mean, we could swap it out, but for metrics, we actually use the Prometheus only library because it's like 100 times simpler than the OpenTelemetry one. But we can swap it out. There's an abstraction on top of it anyway, so it's not
metrics is already like something that's second after the telemetry, right? So yeah, telemetry first makes sense, I guess.
Sorry, telemetry to me.
Or sorry, traces.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, there we use the tracing library for everything, and that is a common higher level library that you can have we use standard out, but you can hook it up to OpenTelemetry if you want.
That's a start.
Yeah, we can support both, right, John? We can have, support for zTunnel for ambient, right? We can support both Prometheus and OpenTelemetry, right? So maybe the users can choose between the two providers.
Well, we could, but I think really there's that one open issue on ambient of what does telemetry look like in ambient? And that's not solved. We still haven't solved, do we want zTunnel and Waypoint to emit L4 and L7 metrics for the same traffic? Today we don't do that. Does Waypoint have its own reporter? Is it a source? Is it a destination? I think we're getting stuck in the low level details of use this OpenTelemetry client implementation in Envoy, but we're missing a high level vision for what telemetry in Istio looks like in the future. What is our North Star for how telemetry works?
Yeah, I envision, right, like you mentioned that for the interoperability, between service meshes, including ambient, Cilium, and a bunch, right? So for ambient, I would say, if we have defined the OpenTelemetry based semantic convention, we have a set of metrics and metric labels, and that defines the telemetry for ambient. And for example, Istio, ambient, and other, if they want to adopt OpenTelemetry standard, they can all have this common telemetry support for OpenTelemetry, including the, for example, I mentioned a few key metrics such as the latency, the delivery ratio, and the traffic, and also the source for labels, source and destination workload. With that, I think the in terms of data, ambient can support the same data as the Istio. And API-wise, for example, Prometheus API and the OpenTelemetry API. So that a rough idea, I would say, maybe makes sense for so the customer don't need to worry, when they switch between Istio and ambient, they probably need to change their pipelines. They don't need, if ambient Istio conform to the same OpenTelemetry semantic convention, they don't need to make any changes to their CI/CD or whatever pipeline,
so
the dashboard.
To take a step back and in Istio Classic, we have the backward compatibility and we cannot change really too much. But for both ambient and safe, we have an option to make some changes. And having OTLP, for example, as a default and only protocol for ambient and safe is not unreasonable. And L4 metrics in zTunnel, I don't think we can avoid them because there is no waypoint. question is if we are willing to, maybe for next hour, next meeting, if we are willing to use to adopt the open telemetry standards for ambient when we launch or shortly after. And that's a question for John, I think.
Yes, I think that is I don't know the answer to that question. I think that is the question we should ask, though. Like, let me know if this makes sense, but what I envision as being most useful is forgetting all about legacy, backwards compatibility, cruft. Like, what is the vision for what we want telemetry to look like in Istio? And it's like, we have these different components, Z-tunnel, sidecar, ambient. What metrics do they emit with what attributes? And then taking that and saying, how can we make sure that this is actually aligned with what other products are doing so that we have a common standard between them? And how can we make this actually implemented? And how can we get users from where we are today to there and have some sort of migration plan? I think we're moving one step at a time instead of looking at what we want and then working backwards from there. And I worry that we're not going to get to the right end state if we do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I agree with you, John, on that. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that hotel collector is not a very, it's a new system. So whatever you do, things will be unstable for a while, and you need to be careful about it. We did the same design with Mixer, and it's not something that's easy to scale.
It's not like what we have today is extremely stable, John, after all those years. So
I think the new design for telemetry that does not depend on collector is more stable. That was the whole point of the open Mixer. So if you go back to collector for core functions, we have to solve those scaling issues that we had before.
Actually, let me clarify a bit. Collector is not, I'm not discussing a collector for metrics. I'm discussing for tracing and access logs. And the reason I think the collector is very important is because otherwise we'll have to deal with authentication with all the different providers, and that's the hard part. If we let the collector take care, which can be per cluster, it doesn't have to be, act as a proxy effectively, that is authenticating, doing some filtering, doing some enhancement. We avoid a lot of complexity in Istio, and that's probably worth it.
I understand, and that's why we had Mixer in the first version of Istio. It's a very useful and very feature-capable system. The problem is scaling it. So
yes, but Mixer was doing far more than that, and it was not a simple proxy that is just aggregating. And I hope we learn some lessons from it.
I think they're actually about the same. If I looked at the hotel collector, and it's pretty much the same. Attributes are free form, they're symbolic, there's no meaning to them except they're just symbols. All the collection happens as modules in collector.
Yeah, but it's for access log and tracing, and will be opt-in. So if the user want 1% of traces, it will raise the price for that 1%, while Mixer initially it was owned by default for everything. It was used for metrics as well. So there are some subtle differences, and all the compressions that Mixer was doing, it's not quite the same.
I don't know. It looks to me quite the same. But anyways, I think we just have to be careful about if we make it a mandatory requirement to have collector, that we have to make sure it scales. I'm okay if it's optional. You don't have to
optional for sure. Nobody said mandatory, but if the user has a collector, we should use it because it's there. And if they have a per cluster 8 collector, again, it's their choice. If they don't, then we don't generate the traces. What can we do?
Yeah, for collector, what I heard from the open telemetry folks. It has a few advantages. One advantage is it can have the different adapters. One mentioned by Costin is it can hide all these authentication details. Another, it can support the different backends. For example, it can hide the, if you have a collector, then the collector can export the telemetry to stack driver promises. You can, basically adapting to different backends. Another advantage is actually on the scalability. So they are saying, right, for example, Envoy has a limited processing capability, right, CPU, memory. if you use collectors, all these complicated operations can be, handled by collector, and the collector can, scale up horizontally, you scale up 100 copies of that. So, but I agree, it probably is optional, because if you want a collector, you need to configure that, configure the endpoint, and probably we can, keep it as an option. Yeah.
I mean, all of that is not new. I mean, we know the advantages. That's why we had Mixer, right? All of those existed with Mixer.
Yeah.
The question is basically, if we make collector part of Istio from a mandate requirement, we are responsible for it.
Yeah.
That means we need to provide guidance and make sure it scales.
Quite
And that's something that's not easy.
Nobody's proposing to make it mandatory. What we are saying is, if it is available, use it, because someone probably installed it and is maintaining it. If we find a collector, we use it. Otherwise, there is no collector.
Well, it is proposed because, for example, if you want to control trace sampling, you can do it either in collector or you can do it in Envoy. And the suggestion I hear is that it should be on a collector.
No.
That's a problem.
That was one, one idea that it could be done. I don't think anyone is seriously proposing this.
Right. So I'm just arguing that we should control the production, and we should provide all the controls that enable scaling, things like sampling, reducing the metrics, reducing the attributes.
Define
That's
control.
our responsibility.
What define control? Do you mean Istio should define APIs for this, or Istio should implement the APIs defined by other forums?
I don't really care. I just don't know any other API for this stuff. I haven't seen any universal trace sampling API anywhere. I don't really care. I mean, as long as it's some API. Most people don't really do it often that it deserves a full-fledged API. It's usually like a one-off thing.
A couple things. One, to answer your question in chat, would it be in scope for Gamma? It's not technically in scope for Gamma, but Gamma also happens to be the only place where all the mesh vendors meet up. So it's been kind of used as a bucket for any mesh things. So it's possible we could formally expand it, or at least pitch the idea there where all the mesh vendors happen to be in, just kick things off. Other thing I want to say is I agree with Quat, or I think I do and have slightly varied opinion, that just because OpenTelemetry is the standard and it's kind of the new future thing everyone's aligned on, doesn't mean it's perfect and did everything better and everything we did in Istio was terrible. Like, we've learned a lot of mistakes on how not to do telemetry and fixed a lot of things. Like, we have lots of experience with cardinality issues, with the metrics expiry, all these things. It's our responsibility to make sure that OpenTelemetry and our usage of it doesn't regress in those ways, whether that means we're careful in our implementation or we even have to change OpenTelemetry, right? Most of OpenTelemetry has experimental surface that could be potentially changed. Like, in their definition of metrics, I'm pretty sure in one place they have IP address, which is probably a bad idea for our usage of reporting metrics from a cardinality perspective. That's the type of thing that we may consider whether we need to prod the OpenTelemetry spec to change. Like, that's just surface level. I don't know that that's the case, but we should be looking at this with the critical eye and making sure that it actually meets our needs, not just wholesale adopting it because it's a standard, right?
Yeah, just to clarify, John, right? So this P2P versus centralized architecture, we are not saying one way or the other. We intend to, have both, support both. So by P2P, right? So the approach is the current, Istio approach.
Yeah, I'm not talking about any architecture. I just mean this entire project. We need to make sure that we are not just adopting a standard, but we are actually shipping something that's production usable to users. Like, OpenTelemetry is a standard. It's good. It's very flexible, well-defined. It's also something that doesn't have production testing on a large-scale mesh that's reporting metrics in ways like Istio has before, right? So we should be aware that it's both a new standard and we're kind of cutting edge in our usage of it, as I think we're kind of in a somewhat unique position. So we need to make sure that we are willing to thoroughly test it and potentially upstream some changes as needed to make sure it fits our needs as well. Right?
Yeah, agree. There's a complexity, extra complexity for deploying the collector. And I think we should keep both options. You know, if you want to use the collector, fine, right? We support it. If you want to P2P directly export to your backend, that's fine, right?
Nothing I said was about collectors or not. It was about the entire project, whether that's the actual schema of the metrics we emit, whether we use a collector or not, all of it, right? It's all relevant.
Okay.
Yeah.
Case?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of zooming out a little bit and ask a clarification on the open census sunset process. What timeline are we looking at? Because I think that might help answer some questions about prioritization and, you know, what timeline we're thinking about making these changes in.
Yeah. So, Case, what I heard from the you know, open telemetry, the open census folks is they plan to deprecate the end of this year. But I think we can, you know, have a conversation with them saying, you know, for example, if you want to deprecate this one, what is the replacement? I think they are currently, for example, they don't have a very stable replacement for, you know, for all the telemetry related APIs. For example, for tracing, they are currently not production ready. They are committed to make it production ready. For application logs, they are saying, you know, they are going to develop one, but, you know, we need to have a conversation with them to make sure they will not deprecate it before the replacement are ready or production ready. Yeah, Costin.
But let's take a step back. I mean, open census implementation is getting deprecated, and we can move to the open telemetry SDK without any problem. And that's and I don't know if Envoy even is using. But for tracing and for logging, we do support logging to OTLP, and Envoy supports it. I mean, it's a support feature in Envoy that we document, and so it's not, we cannot say it's alpha, but it's production ready in Istio, but it's alpha in OpenTelemetry because we support both of them today.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I just wanted to say what I mentioned is that I think it's safer to switch to protocol first before changing the metrics, names, and conventions. It's just somebody has to pay the price, I guess, on the hotel side to later on when we start changing them. But I think we can switch to the protocol much sooner than the whole thing, and maybe we should stage it that way.
Yeah,
we don't have to switch. I mean, we support the it's just start using and defaulting to it and recommending people to use it, because again, it's not no switch. We use OTLP for tracing and access log today as one of the many other protocols.
Yes, but we can, but we don't. We need a full-fledged, you know, user experience here, not just an option. So
yeah, that would be my point. Sorry, go ahead. I thought you were done.
No, go ahead. I'm done.
I was going to say to your point that you know, if open census, the the actual wire protocol in the library is going to be deprecated, then at that point I feel like it makes sense to actually do a full-fledged switch, so that users aren't concerned that we're using a deprecated thing. And I think going back to Lei and Whitney, the doc is great. I think it highlights a lot of different things that we want to do with telemetry and Istio. But I think what I'm missing is, okay, what are the quick wins that we can get and within the timeline that we're looking at due to open census sunset, and you know, how to execute on those. And then concurrently, we can be changing, we can be working on semantic conventions, collector architecture, like we can do all those things in parallel. But we can get the quick wins first, I think, is what I'm wanting to see more of from the doc.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think Case and Quad, I think your point is right. So basically, this data part, this data standard part, probably is going to take a longer time, right? So we can probably first switch to using their protocol, right? OTLP, their OpenTelemetry API, which I agree, because you know, the conversion of our current proprietary you know, telemetry data is probably going to take a longer time to conform to the industry standard. Yeah.
Quite, can I ask why Envoy implement it directly instead of using an SDK? Just out of curiosity.
Because Envoy's gRPC facilities are good enough, and they're much more stable than whatever OpenTelemetry is implementing.
And why not? I mean, it's a pretty simple.
Right. I mean, it's just gRPC protocol.
Yeah,
can do it
I
efficiently.
mean, it's reasonable too. I just wasn't sure if there was like SDK performed poorly or was overcomplicated or XYZ.
It's different use case. I mean, SDK is usually application
Yeah, okay, fair.
SDK. So
Yeah.
if you have only one client, while Envoy is multiple clients, multiple
No,
servers.
the SDK is using the Google gRPC implementation, C++, and Envoy is using a gRPC library, so it makes a lot of sense for them. But it makes sense for us as well. We choose.
What do you mean by we? Like we in Go or?
In
We for
zTunnel or for example,
Okay,
if you
yeah.
choose to use directly gRPC and not use an SDK,
But-
whatever
but-
is more convenient.
But even when we switch to using OpenTelemetry, we are still using the gRPC endpoint. For example, for access log, it's just the access log gRPC endpoint, right? So the gRPC part, I'm not sure is the reason that behind the Envoy choosing, this directly export to our backend, for example, Stackdriver or Prometheus.
So
Well,
whatever-
there is some complexity there. Like OpenSensus does fancy things about concurrent metric recognition. There's like a ring buffer there or something that's efficient.
I understand that there is a complexity of conforming to the OTLP because when it exports the, for example, access log, right, it needed to use the OTLP standard. But other than that, the gRPC part is the same.
Yeah, so the difference is basically emission of metrics. So when you generate metrics in the application, the requirement was to have a minimal CPU overhead, right? So OpenSensus gave you like, I think within 2% CPU overhead, which is hard to achieve in concurrent applications.
I see.
Because Envoy's stat system is already sophisticated enough. They didn't need that.
I see your point. Yeah.
So, can you confirm that Envoy is not using any OpenSensus, at least in the version of Istio that we use?
Envoy uses OpenSensus SDK,
For?
Stackdriver.
Okay, but without Stackdriver, except for Stackdriver, we are okay?
And also for tracing to Stackdriver.
Okay, again, if you use OpenTelemetry options, you don't enable any Stackdriver option, we are okay.
Yeah, the OpenSensus is only used in Istio for Stackdriver.
Okay.
But because OpenSensus is like OpenTelemetry in the past, so it's like one library that does everything. So you can emit from OpenSensus to Zipkin using OpenSensus SDK in Envoy. You understand that? Or?
You know, I understand that we are only talking about the mode where Istio Safe is configuring OpenTelemetry only options, no Zipkin, no Stackdriver, just Prometheus plus.
Right. If it's just OTLP, then there is no requirement to use OpenSensus.
Then we are safe.
Right. That's why we are doing this.
But there is Istio D as well, by the way, where we are using. I think we are still using OpenSensus.
Yeah, that's correct. For Istio D, we are using OpenSensus.
And that's just a library swap?
Yes.
Yeah,
the data is proprietary. Yeah, the Istio.io, proxy clients, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, as a library notel, it's actually have fewer dependencies. It has some benefits as well. So it's a worth investment if we find some volunteer to do it in Istio.
Yeah, OpenSensus is actually more stable. A lot of OpenTelemetry stuff currently is, experimental, or they have different status for different languages, and yeah. But that's the direction to go. Yeah. I think we run out of time. We are going to have the ambient meeting. Yeah. Okay, thanks.